was never the same again, because what shocked me about the church was the sheer venom which was directed towards me. I just couldn't think it possible that a church which is supposedly based on love should do the kind of things. At one stage, we had to have under police protection. And they were church people who were doing this sort of thing. And that, of course, was a turning point in my life. Up until that time, from the time I had come into the church in 1937, I had regarded the church as a kind of holy people, different from any other society. From this time onwards, I came to realise the church is just as human as any other society in the world. Now, it didn't mean, however, that I left the church. As a matter of fact, at that stage, for 2 or 3 years, I was hoping that the church would go forward from that point and burst out into new life and new thinking, and it did for 2 or 3 years, until reaction started to set in. And reaction set in about 3 years later. I'd been invited to go and speak to a congregation in Queensland, my old haunts there, and I did so, and in the course of this I had a session on television at 7 o'clock Sunday evening, prime time, in which 4 journalists peppered me with questions for half an hour. I answered 61 questions in half an hour. Do you believe in the virgin birth? No. So it went on. Well, there was another big to-do in the paper next day that didn't matter too much in Queensland. What happened, however, was that my evangelical colleagues in New Zealand had colleagues in Queensland, and the whole thing was transported back into Queensland and into New Zealand, where the headlines were even bigger there than they were. I thought I was quite safe being. I was in a foreign country here in Australia. But no, it wasn't like that. So at the end of that year, these people in the General Assembly decided that they would have a motion at the General Assembly dissociating itself from my views, which it did. Well, that wasn't very conducive to a future career in the church, but I would have carried on, except that in the meantime I had applied for another position, and I got that 3 weeks later. Some of the church people heaved a sigh of relief that they were at last rid of me. So that was now another turning point. I was appointed to the first chair of religious studies in Australasia, in Wellington, and the interesting thing is, how did this chair come about? It came about because the Students' Association had put in a plea to the University Council that a chair in religious studies, all religious traditions, should be established. It was in answer to students. And that's the chair which I took. Now I was free to explore. I was immediately asked by my university, what is your special interest of research? Well, I hadn't had one before that. So I replied that my research would be, what is happening to religion worldwide? Why is the change taking place? And I, after 1 year, established a special second-year course called Religion in Change. And out of that, eventually, I published a book, which was called Faith's New Age, and which was later republished in America slightly revised under a new title of Christianity at the Crossroads. And what my research led me to, very simply, because I don't want to go on too long, is this. In the long cultural and religious history of humankind, there have been two great periods of rapid, radical change. The first was on either side of the year 2500 BC. Now, already people had begun to notice that this was the period in which all the great religious traditions had their origin. Buddhism, Judaism, Confucianism, Taoism, and out of Judaism, of course, came Christianity and Islam. What my researchers now showed was that there was a second period of radical change, but it took place only in one area. Previously, it had taken place simultaneously, more or less, in about 6 different places. But the second one took place only in one, and that was Western Europe, or if you like, Western Christendom. And the first signs of it were the Renaissance and the Reformation, leading on to the great dividing line, the Enlightenment, and there is no turning back into a return to pre-Enlightenment stages, and that it had this second axial period is undermining all the great religious traditions in their traditional form. It doesn't mean it brings them to an end. It undermines them in their traditional form. And if they are going to play a role in the future, then they have to undergo radical change in order to do so. So that was the result of my research, and since that time I have been writing further books elaborating what is taking place. So I'll just conclude this little bit by referring to some of those. It so happened that I never saw myself as a writer at all, you know. And it was only when the theological controversy was going on in New Zealand that Hodder and Stoughton invited me to write a book about it. So I wrote a book about it. It was called God in the New World. And then I followed that up by writing a book on the resurrection. The resurrection is a fascinating theme. It didn't start after the death of Jesus. It'd been going on for 1,000 years. It's in the Old Testament. You all know about the valley of dry bones of Ezekiel, resurrection, you see. So this was a common theme. Well, I wrote all about that. Then came the book that I also referred to. Then in 1998, I was over in Oxford with my late wife, who was then doing a PhD, and she was working in the library there too. And she said, you might as well get on writing a book. And so I started thinking, where are we going in the 3rd millennium? And out of that came another book called The World to Come, meaning not heaven, but the 3rd millennium, and all the kind of things we're going to face in the 3rd millennium. It's going to be Judgment Day in many respects for the human race. It's as serious as that. And how do we find the knowledge and the faith to face these things? Well, I won't elaborate them here, but it's that. And my most recent one, just out last year, is called Coming Back to Earth, in which I sort of trace in